So talk a little bit about high-level cultural Marxism. I mean, I love the paper, The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct, which I assume is sort of that toxic masculinity trope that that the left throws around. But talk more broadly about what is cultural Marxism.
Well, we'll start here. The Southern Poverty Law Center says through his multiple communication channels, Lindsay continues to spread his various conspiracy theories in aversion to what he deems as, quote, wokeness. Most of his rhetoric focuses on the specter of cultural Marxism/communism, a supposed white genocide, and the alleged indoctrination of children by sinister forces. And so that didn't really say a lot about what cultural Marxism is. I think they mentioned it again somewhere. His concentration on combating communism and cultural Marxism in America earned him prominence in the reactionary anti-student inclusion movement. I don't know what that is. That rapidly gained traction through the country at the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's not very helpful, but I did just want to highlight that the Southern Poverty Law Center seems to think that it's important that I'm fighting against this. As a matter of fact, I've been listed as a conspiracy theorist on my Wikipedia, for example, specifically for talking about cultural Marxism. So cultural Marxism is a interesting thing. I apologize that this is going to require a little unpacking, and I hate when things require that. It's not that hard to understand, but there's this weirdness around it. There are a variety of names for a school of thought that arose in the 1920s and 1930s to address the problem that the Bolshevik Revolution only took place in a peasant society, which was exactly the opposite of where Marx said it would work. And it would not take place in the West. And one of the architects of this school of thought, who is named Antonio Gramsci, was frustrated that the Italian workers' parties would not unify amongst themselves and trigger a communist revolution in Italy. He was also frustrated that they wouldn't unify with the workers' parties in other countries and internationally, and were in fact most enthralled by the nationalistic aspects of these parties in the first place, the Italian part. And so he was frustrated about this. And of course, that is where the birth of the fascist movement really kind of came from. And so he was trying to write a analysis to explain why it is that, for this so-called school of thought, to explain why it is that Marxism was taking hold in the wrong places and not in the places predicted by Marx, by means not predicted by Marx. And so Lenin was taking over a bunch of peasants by promising them they'd be able to get better work, as opposed to workers rising up and saying work is exploitative and we're going to overthrow our oppressors and seize the means of production. And then thirdly, to understand why it's just not happening in the West overall. So that school of thought is sometimes referred to as Western Marxism. It is sometimes referred to as cultural Marxism, because his answer was that the West had robust cultural institutions that produce and transmit values that repel communism. And in particular, he named 5 cultural institutions, and those were religion, family, education, media, and law, were all in the West attached to Western values, and were transmitting and promoting and maintaining Western values that excluded communism. And so his strategy was to do cultural subversion by entering into those, or infiltrating, I really should say, those cultural institutions and creating a new way of thinking. He called it a counter hegemony. I'm trying not to use too many big words. Within the institutions that would then promulgate new cultural values out to transform the society from within, so that a communist revolution would be fruitful eventually. And so this is sometimes called cultural Marxism, but the communists, being very savvy operators, claim that cultural Marxism is a dog whistle for disliking Jewish people, that it's an anti-Semitic dog whistle, because many of the people that were involved in the building of Western Marxism were in fact Jewish, or at least they were people who claimed to be Jews, one way or the other, or they had Jewish parentage or something of this kind. What binds them together is not their religion, but rather that they were communists, as evidenced by the fact that they were also big fans later of Mao Zedong, who is famously not very Jewish. Turns out he's sort of Chinese.
Point.
So Western Marxism or cultural Marxism is a school of thought that was architected by Antonio Gramsci in Italy, George Lukács in Hungary primarily, and then the Frankfurt School, which developed obviously in Frankfurt, Germany, at the University of Goethe in Frankfurt, and which was originally called the Institute for Marxism. But then they changed it to the Institute for Social Research so that it would kind of be a little under the radar. And so if you go, for example, now to Wikipedia and you type in cultural Marxism, it'll direct you to a page called Cultural Marxism Conspiracy Theory. This was not true 5 years ago or even 4 years ago. I don't know exactly when that changed, but I remember that it did. But you can now, there is a link that will take you to the old page that explains that there's this whole school of thought that thought to use Marxist conflict-based stratified class analysis across cultural issues, cultural infiltration and subversion in order to prepare the West to be taken over in a communist revolution, which was going to take complete values subversion and inversion to accomplish. That also explains the aspect of it that is actually a conspiracy theory, that is the Jews run everything and they created communism in order to be able to subvert the West because they want to be, whatever Jewish destruction, Tikkun Olam or whatever the hell Olam that they say it is.
Tikkun Olam.
Yeah, you can see I'm super versed and interested in this. So
got it.
So cultural Marxism is a school of thought. Maybe it's better just to avoid this stupid SPLC horse to call it Western Marxism. It has definitive fathers who wrote copiously. George Lukács very famously wrote a very, I think, accessible, given that it's communism, book in 1923 called History and Class Consciousness that lays out what became a lot of Western Marxism. Antonio Gramsci wrote this stuff down in what are collected in what's known as the prison notebooks, which span over 3,000 pages that he wrote in prison after the Italian fascists threw him in prison to quote unquote stop his brain from working for 20 years. He died in prison 11 years later. So his brain only ended up not working for 9 of the years. And for the other 11, he wrote 3,000 pages of some of the most influential communist doctrine ever written in secret in his prison cell. And so these are known architects. The Frankfurt School arises in 1920-ish, 23-ish, something like that, massively funded and grows in influence. And its, early members are like Max Horkheimer and Walter Benjamin and all these are people with names who wrote books with their names on them. It's not hard to see what the line of thought or school of thought is. And then eventually, Horkheimer and Marcuse and Adorno, who are big prominent members of the Frankfurt School, Erich Fromm, Hitler takes a chancellorship in the 30s in Germany. They're like, we better get the hell out of Dodge. And so they were brought to the United States to get asylum from Hitler's fascist regime. And the United States decided that these people that are like blatant cultural subverters needed to be brought into major institutions like major universities, Brandeis, Columbia, UCLA, UCSD. Maybe one of them ended up in Berkeley for a while. I can't remember. And then also Herbert Marcuse gets stuck in the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which is the precursor to the CIA. So this is who's building out the thing that becomes our CIA in the 1940s, if you can imagine. So cultural Marxism is a school of thought that says we're going to use cultural analysis to try to transform the values of the West to make it more fruitful to communism.
So that's where we start. So cultural Marxism basically is like the foundation and the undergirding of all of the separation that we see happening, where you have the the theories or the oh my goodness, what's the
Critical race theory, queer theory, that kind of stuff.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the foundation of all of that stuff.
Yeah. So what
Where
was going on? Gramsci had this idea of cultural infiltration and subversion, and that was big. And then Lukács had this idea, who I mentioned, the Hungarian, had this idea that actually class consciousness is an educable thing. It's graduated. It's not like you just wake up one day and you have class consciousness. There are stages of learning, and it can be taught. And so you have this emphasis of bringing it into education and teaching people what it means to have class consciousness. It's not just by getting ranted at by Marxists and reading their books that all of a sudden you're going to have it. There was actually an educational mode that this is the third chapter of History and Class Consciousness for anybody who wants to go read it then for themselves, where he's laying it out. And then the mode of analysis of the Frankfurt School was particularly how is culture produced and how do we subvert the production of culture. And so you have, for example, Theodore Adorno, who I mentioned, being excessively angry about jazz music, saying that jazz was its own form of cultural rot and subversion. And so he had these long things he wrote about how he didn't like jazz music and how this was, indicative of maybe Weimar kind of mentality that would degrade the culture and lead to the fascist catastrophe. And then you had them talking about what they called the culture industry. So they talked about the way that culture and thus, in fact, you as a person, who you think you are in the West and advanced capitalism is commodified and sold to you. So you are sold through advertisements, an image of who you think you're supposed to be. And that person happens to drink Coca-Cola, so you'll go buy Coca-Cola. And so the culture industry became the target of their analysis. In the 1960s, they became frustrated because they realized they are not going to motivate people on economic means, and the cultural analysis was too abstract. And so Marcuse extremely clearly writes down that what has to happen is that we have to abandon the working class as the proletariat revolutionary class and move into different modes of cultural analysis where there is what he called the vital energy for revolution. And that vital energy was to be found, he said, in the ghetto populations, racial minorities, sexual minorities, feminists, and outsiders, who are to be brought together and cobbled together and then enlightened to the concrete nature of their oppression through college students who are being indoctrinated in the schools that they had already infiltrated. This was explicitly written down in One Dimensional Man in a repeated short form it was 64 and 65, his essay Repressive Tolerance. He mentions it, but it's laid out in pretty heavy detail in his 1969 essay, that's a essay on liberation, Counter-Revolution and Revolt. Instructs the wholesale infiltration of professions in the entire professional class. So that's Marcuse's writings from 64 to 72, laying this plan out. And he was an extraordinarily influential leftist at the time.
Now that sounds like, when you say that, like, sexual minorities, racial minorities, basically that was the Obama coalition that was formed to get him elected president. It was
Well, that
like,
all
if
makes
we
sense.
right, so if we take all of the people who feel slighted, basically, and market to them that, we're all one group, even though on paper some of these groups might not otherwise get along, but there's a big gap of time between when we're talking about the 30s and the 60s and 70s and 2000s when Obama gets elected. So that is is it like, do we think that there was a concerted intentional effort to degrade and erode all of these institutions in order to get there?
Yes.
Or is it just that it just happened over time? Like,
Also, yes, but both of those things were happening. So this was being infused into the culture, but is primarily being infused into the culture through education.
mm,
Entertainment started catching on later. McCarthy was not wrong about the communist influences in Hollywood, but it was primarily being infused into the culture through through education. And there
mm,
was a concerted effort for them to get into education at all levels. That's a direct quote from Marcuse in Counter-Revolution and Revolt in 1972.
mm,
And the
okay.
goal, and so you bring up Obama. None of this is abstract. None of this is like just mystery conspiracies floating out in the air. I bring up Marcuse. We'll get to Obama. Watch this. So Marcuse had all these ideas and he pushed all these ideas into the university at every level. And the university system, for whatever reasons, maybe Shelby Steele is one of the most enlightening writers on this issue, was caving into this leftist agenda over and over and over again through the 60s and 70s. Massive amounts of white guilt, or whatever, as Shelby Steele attributes it to. They were taking it up. They were building out women's departments or women's studies departments. They were building out race studies departments. They were building out ethnic studies became law in 67 or 8 or something like that in California, to have ethnic
67.
studies education at the UC system. And so they were building out this educational apparatus, because if you get the education system, you train the students, thus you get the future professionals, and the future professionals shape the world. And so it's pretty clear how this works. But one of Marcuse's students specifically was Angela Davis. It was one of his PhD students. And Angela Davis went on to help found this thing called the Combahee River Collective, which was a collective of Black feminist socialist lesbians who were the first ones to lay out this kind of intersectional idea that all of the forms of oppression are interlinked: sex, class, race, sexuality, and so on, and that it has to be understood in that way, which later got codified by Kimberly Crenshaw. Well, Kimberly Crenshaw was a PhD student. She's the one famous for so-called intersectionality. She named it. She's considered also the founding mother of critical race theory, which she also named. But she was a PhD or doctoral, I guess it's JD probably, student, I don't know which doctorate it is, of Derek Bell, who is credited as actually the father of critical race theory. Derek Bell was a mentor of Barack Obama, who was teaching him the same exact legal theory before that. And Obama held Bell up and honored him. More than that, the same strategy was implemented by the dying radical guard, not dying in the physical dying sense.
Wow.
My mind always feels like it's melting after I talk to James.
It's so much information. Talking to him and Bruce at the same time, are like, that's the dream. I want to get those two
Dream team
in a room to just nerd out.
I would love that. I would oh my God, get them talking about Marxism and the stuff going on in the Middle East right now.
Yeah,
They'd probably, anyway.
And the concept of when you start talking about Marxism and intersectionality and the origins of a lot of these things, now you're looking at stuff with knowing that there were Jewish professors that were part of that plan. And now we're seeing the end result of it being, it's going bad and it's not going well for them.
Yeah.
That sucks.
Yeah. But the Marxism cannot allow for dissent. That's the thing that's funny, is like the murdering of tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people in, China, North Korea, Russia, all that stuff. That's a feature, not a bug. Okay? Because if you dissent, if you don't go along with it, you have to be gotten rid of. Like, that's part of the plan. If you don't go along to get along, you get on out.
Well, I mean, whenever you're talking about things like communism and socialism, you are inherently leaning towards authoritarianism. You can't take my labor, my money, my land and redistribute it or whatever without the monopoly of violent force.
Exactly.
By a group of people against an individual or a smaller group of individuals. Like, there's no way around that.
Yeah. Most people are not going to willingly give up their stuff and give away their labor to get nothing particularly in return.
Correct. I mean, maybe from a spiritual perspective, you could make some of that kind of work if you can get people's altruism going. But the state isn't really good at that. The state is not asking for your altruism. They are demanding it. And just the concept of you demanding anything from me already makes me mad. Like, if you walked up to me on the street and there was something I want, hey man, could you spare $1 for, the homeless guy on the street? I might. Yeah. I might, if I feel so inclined, or buy him a sandwich. But if you walked up to me and said, hey man, you need to give your money to this guy. Oh, bro. Oh man. Yeah. Look, I'm gonna go get a sandwich and I'm gonna eat it in your face.
Yep.
That's how that works.
And that I think is the most important point in all of this is Marxists, communists, these leftists do not understand the fundamental truth of human nature. And I don't know if it's their godlessness that causes that. I don't know how you cannot understand how human beings operate.
Yeah.
But I can tell you how we operate here at Of the People. We look for your donations, your support. So make sure you like this video, share this video, subscribe to our channel. And remember, subscribing does not cost you anything. It is free. It is absolutely free, but it tells the big tech overlords that you like our stuff and that they should share it with more people.
Best things in life are free.
The best things in life are free.
Or horribly expensive.
You get me some Janet Jackson, I'm all day. Okay.
Yep.
all day. But what's not all day is this show. So make sure you come back next week. Robert will be back. We'll be in studio bringing you some new information. Maybe we'll even have a new guest.
Tell them what we did.
All right.
Okay.
All right. See you guys.